Hi, Year 13s. I hope everyone's keeping well. Today we'll be going over 10 years of history instead of 20 years of history, and what this will mean is that the video will be much shorter, and it will also allow you to make notes in greater depth on fewer events. Um, so in 1921, we've got the first sort of non-cooperation movement, a nationwide non-cooperation movement, and this builds on the early Gandhian struggles from 1917 to 1918, where Gandhi took up the issues of the local peasantry and the local people in various regions across India, such as obviously his campaign in Champaran, where peasants were required to grow the ruinous cash crop, the indigo crop, in the Kerala district of Gujarat, where he campaigned alongside those who were campaigning, well, who were launching no revenue campaigns, and also in Gujarat as well, when he sort of championed the right of workers against the Gujarat mill owners. Okay, so in 1921, you've got the first nationwide non-cooperation movement. Okay, and what we title this as is something called Satyagraha, okay, and that is translated as soul force or truth force. Okay, this is the doctrine. This is the doctrine which underpins the sort of the Gandhian movements across the early part of the 20th century. Okay, and this can be translated as soul force or truth force. And the purpose of this sort of doctrine that underpins many of his nationwide movements is to touch the opponent's heart, awaken his sense of humanity, and activate his moral impulse. Now, obviously, Gandhi preached non-violence, and many of his nationwide movements and many of his sort of localized movements in various regions across India, they sort of relied on the fact that the wider sort of people, the wider sort of population, the peasantry taking part would maintain this sort of ethos of non-violence. It would strictly adhere to those rules, which Gandhi sort of vehemently believed in, so that he could obviously achieve, or he could see those aims achieved without the need to resort to violence. Immediately, without me telling you anything, or without you knowing anything about the sort of effectiveness of the movements that you'll explore, you could probably, having read this, think about some limitations perhaps with this doctrine which underpins his movements, and therefore you might be able to reflect immediately on what could be the possible failures of his movement. So the non-cooperation movement was launched in 1921, in January 1921, and the movement was launched. So the cause of the movement there were a number of factors which led to the non-cooperation movement. Those factors range from the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and the Rowlatt Acts, so the Amritsar massacre and the Rowlatt Acts, and also to the fact that the British had mobilised a lot of Indian soldiers in World War One, and they have not really provided them with any significant concessions, which would lead to a considerable increase of Indians sort of running their own affairs in India. And there were also sort of economic reasons that Britain had financially sort of drained India as a result of its participation in the mobilization of resources in India towards the war effort. So in 1921, Congress, this is a Congress-led movement, so Gandhi launches and Congress launches the non-cooperation movement. Okay, now this is the first nationwide mass peasant movement. Okay, and it's the first nationwide Satyagraha which takes place. And the aim of this movement, the aim of this non-cooperation movement, is to make the British Raj ungovernable. Okay, and there are a number of ways. There's a plethora of ways in which the elites, the Congress leadership, and Gandhi seek to do this. Okay, through obviously non-violent means, without the need to resort to violence. So these included boycotting elections, the non-payment of taxes, students, for example, not sitting exams, lawyers, Indian lawyers, sort of stepping down from their posts in courts of law in India. So Indians who were also appointed to any sort of governmental posts, they would step down as well. There was the boycotting of any sort of Raj events held by the British Raj, refusal to buy any imported goods. So there was a stop to the purchase of foreign goods, and emphasis was placed on ensuring that Indians were able to make their own sort of materials and resources that were required, such as cloth, for example. And there was also the need to stop children from attending government schools, and an emphasis was therefore placed on Indians sort of running their own sort of localized educational sort of systems and educational schools. Now, obviously, some of these were unrealistic. Some of these worked a lot better than others. Now, the non-cooperation movement was intended initially for the middle class. It was generally a movement which would encompass middle class participation. As you can see, obviously boycotting elections, only middle class people would be able to stand up for elections. Even when it came to exams, seeking an education, leaving government posts, leaving posts in the courts of law, so any lawyers stepping down, refusal to attend Raj events, refusal to buy any imported goods, only middle class people in general were able to do those things, and were able to obviously hold posts hold governmental posts, and even sort of have occupations such as being a lawyer. So some of these, of course, were unrealistic. Some worked better than others, and I'll point you to some reading in which you can explore the effectiveness of many of these sort of methods to make the British Raj ungovernable. Now, there were some successes. So 200 lawyers stopped work, taxes were not paid, exams were boycotted, and there were what we call hartals. Okay, and those are strikes, worker strikes, which took place across the country. Now, although the non-cooperation movement was intended for mass sort of middle class participation, middle class participation was actually generally quite weak in the non-cooperation movement. And what we see is that the non-cooperation movement spreads to the masses of people, the masses of peasantry across India. Again, one of the sort of misconceptions about the non-cooperation movement is that it's a Gandhian-led movement, it's a Congress-led movement, which strictly relies on Congress mass mobilization or Gandhian mass mobilization. But in fact, across various sort of regions within India, people mobilized according to their own sort of local struggles. Okay, so the movement took different sort of shapes and forms across the country. It was not always necessarily a sort of, people were not necessarily always mobilizing in the non-cooperation movement under the sort of Congress or Gandhian fold. So, for example, you have local leaders such as C.R. Das in Bengal, who is responsible for mobilizing the sort of younger population in Bengal, because he steps down from his role in the lucrative legal system. So instead of sort of Congress being the driving force of people joining the non-cooperation movement, it is local leaders such as C.R. Das who inspire the younger generation, because he's stepping down from a lucrative role in the legal system. Again, in Punjab, you've got the growth of the Akali movement in the early 1920s. Now, the Akali movement was formed mainly to firstly champion the rights of Sikhs, but also to take back control of Sikh Gurdwara and shrines across Punjab and across India in general, because they were previously run by the British or other non-Sikhs. So what we see is that the Akalis mobilize in sort of one of the largest sort of populations across India for this non-cooperation movement. But obviously they have the aim of ensuring that control of Gurdwara, so Sikh shrines, Sikh temples, are wrestled back from non-Sikhs. As soon as the Akalis achieve this aim, and we see the sort of the Sikh Gurdwara, the Gurdwara Reform Act in the 1920s, which allows Sikhs to take back control of their temples and their shrines. What occurs is that the Akalis and their sort of larger movement, they withdraw from the non-cooperation movement once their localized aim is achieved. And you've got sort of many localized movements like that across India, which you'll read about. So in the case of the Akalis in Punjab, they wanted to ensure that their struggle for a separate Sikh identity wasn't appropriated by the sort of wider the Congress movement. So that is also essential to remember, that movements across the country took different shapes and forms, and it was not always under the fold of the Gandhian and the Congress non-cooperation movement. Rather, people in different regions in India, they sort of manipulated, they took the opportunity, they exploited the opportunity of engaging in this non-cooperation movement to achieve their own localized aims. Now, this non-cooperation movement also runs hand in hand with what we call the Caliphate movement, which begins in 1919. Now, this is also termed as the Indian Muslim movement, and the aim of this sort of Caliphate movement, the aim of this Indian Muslim movement, is to ensure unity amongst the Indian Muslim community, because there's a lot of divisions within the Muslim population in India at the time. And what the Khalifa movement in 1919 attempts to do is to unite the Indian Muslim community around this symbol of the Caliph. Okay, so the Caliphate, which is the sort of monarch of the Ottoman Empire at the time. Now, initially, Congress and Gandhi endorsed the Caliphate movement, as they see this as an opportunity to restore Hindu and Muslim relations, particularly in light of the fact that the British are actively trying to divide religious communities through their policy of divide and rule, and through their sort of institution of constitutional reforms through the process of democratization, such as the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms in 1919, and if we go further back, the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909. And so what we see is as a result of those democratization reforms, those constitutional reforms, is an increase in communalism, okay, an increase in conflict between religious communities which are mobilizing separately as a result of the institution of separate electorates by the colonial administration. And so Gandhi and Congress really see joining with the Caliphate movement as sort of a twofold aim and objective. Firstly, the fact that they can restore relations with the Muslim community, and secondly, if they get the Muslim community on side and endorse the Caliphate movement, they can also then mobilize, they can also galvanize this mass Muslim population for their non-cooperation movement. Now, the Caliphate movement is really, really short-lived, and it ends in 1924. Now, this is primarily because of the fact that after the First World War, there's sort of sanctions placed on the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Emperor as a result of the Treaty of Sèvres, okay, one of the post World War One treaties, okay, and you can obviously look that up. But so as a result of that, as a result of those treaties, the power of the Ottoman Empire really becomes sort of curbed. And in fact, in 1924, there's more secularism introduced into Turkey. So the caliphate is completely the role of the caliph is completely abolished in Turkey. Okay, and as a result of the abolishment of the role of the caliph in the Ottoman Empire, this sort of symbol which allowed the Indian Muslim community to mobilize around, that really sort of ends the Khalifa movement in India as well. So again, you've got mass violence breaking out as well as a sort of byproduct of that. So you've got in 1921, you've got the Mopla Muslims in Malabar declaring a jihad. Okay, so they start killing people of the state, so British and also wealthy Hindu moneylenders. So you've got communal violence occurring in Malabar in 1921, and you've also got Hindus attacking Muslims and forcing them to purify themselves by immersing them in holy water. So you've got Hindu-Muslim conflict increasing, and between 1922 and 1923, you've also got an increase in obviously Hindu-Muslim communal riots across various areas of the subcontinent. Again, it's definitely a failure of the non-cooperation movement because people have resorted to violence when the movement is strictly non-violent. In February 1922, that really sort of marks the end of the movement. February, I think, is the 4th or the 5th of February 1922. What occurs is that Congress supporters torched a police station in Gorakhpur and burned 22 policemen inside. Okay, and this was the Chori Chowra incident. So Gandhi calls an immediate end to the Satyagraha, which shocked his supporters who had sacrificed so much. So as a result of this violent incident in Gorakhpur, which led to the sort of death of 22 policemen, Gandhi calls an end to this non-cooperation movement because of the fact that non-violence wasn't adhered to. Now, obviously, this shocked his supporters. It even angered members of Congress itself, the organization which he was a part of, because they had sacrificed so much, they had worked so hard to organize this movement, and one arguably small incident in a small sort of localized area of India, that incident led to the whole nationwide movement being called off, and that angered many of his own sort of people, his own sort of associates in Congress, and it also angered the Muslim community as well. Now that led to some congressmen such as Nehru traveling across India to connect with the peasant masses and understand their lifestyle. Again, this reading will be really, really helpful for you, and I'll photocopy the pages and put it up for you soon, perhaps over the summer holidays, to read, because you'll also then be introduced to a wealth of sort of statistics which show you that the boycotting really, really did work from an economic perspective. Okay, right, moving on. Right, in 1922 then, Gandhi was arrested and sentenced to prison. Now, Gandhi's arrested on the 10th of March 1922 on charges of sedition. Now, that is inciting hateful speech against the state and actively mobilizing the people to sort of rebel against the state. Now, he's sentenced to prison for 6 years for his involvement in protesting against the British colonial administration, but he only ends up serving 2 years before being released for supposedly medical reasons. So he's released in 1924. in 1927, we've got the Simon Commission. Now, the Government of India Act of 1919, so the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, they were due for inspection in 1929. Now, the Conservatives were in power at the time, but as a result of elections coming up in 1929, Labour were on obviously good terms with Congress, so Conservatives were worried, and they brought back the inspection 2 years earlier in 1927 to avoid sort of a potential Labour government from engaging in negotiation with Congress. Okay, so the Simon Commission is brought back 2 years, and it occurs in 1927 instead of 1929 under the Tory-led government. Now, the Simon Commission was an all-white commission. It was led by Sir John Simon. It's an all-white commission. No Indians take part in that commission, and it's not really received well. Okay, so Congress, the Muslim League, liberal thinkers, they all boycotted the commission. Okay, and as soon as the commission arrived in India, there were people protesting and saying, even holding up slogans and shouting, "Go back, Simon." Okay, Anglo-Indians, poor Muslims, the untouchables, so that's the Dalit caste. They were sort of looked down upon. They were one of the lower castes, and Sikhs. They helped commission some inquiries. Okay, so really it was the marginalized communities, the marginalized groups in India, which sort of tried to help this sort of commission. At this point, Jinnah tries to settle with the Indian Congress. He persuaded members to make a bold offer to Congress to end support for separate electorates if they were guaranteed 1/3 of the seats in the Central Legislative Assembly, and if there was separation of Sindh from Bombay. In hindsight, this could have also stopped the partition from occurring. But the Indian National Congress rejected these sort of proposals. Now, Jinnah proposed many of these ideas in his 14 points. All of these 14 points made by Jinnah on behalf of securing fair representation for the Muslim community in India, that was rejected by Congress. Okay, now Congress is principally known for its exclusionary sort of policies towards the Muslim League, and its sort of alienation of the Muslim League and the Muslim community in general in India, as they claimed, Congress did, to represent all sections of Indian society. Now, as a result of this, Jinnah is angered. He leaves for England, as he believes that it would be difficult for any sort of rapprochement to take place between the Congress and the Muslim League. So Jinnah was against separate electorates because it didn't define people as Indians, but as Hindu and Muslims, which created division. He senses a division taking place and desperately wanted people to reconcile. Congress, however, didn't see Jinnah as important, thought he was a self-appointed leader who didn't represent Muslim opinion. They underestimated how much Muslims wanted their own rights. So this was a fatal failure on behalf of the sort of Congress leadership through their exclusionary policies and through their alienation of the wider Muslim community in India. And in 1928, you've got the Nehru Report. Okay, so Motilal Nehru and T.V. Sapru drew up the first draft of the Indian Constitution. It recommended dominion status. Under this, Hindus would receive a permanent majority within central government. Muslims would get separate states and religious freedom would be safeguarded, but separate electorates were taken away. So Muslims remained unhappy. Now, promises from Congress never really translated into being actioned in practice. This can be seen from the Nehru Report of 1928, but not only that, various promises were made by Congress and people like Jawaharlal Nehru and Gandhi before the partition of 1947. So, for example, Sikhs were promised religious freedoms, and they were promised to be recognized as a separate religion, a separate identity under the Indian Constitution. But those promises by the Congress leadership, they never materialized after partition and after India and Pakistan were created into two nation states. As the Sikhs decided to side primarily with India, those promises by Nehru and Gandhi, they never materialized under the Indian constitution and in the following sort of decades as well. So this is an early sign of the Congress leadership promising concessions to the Muslim community, but them being sort of unlikely to materialize. And again, this reinforces the argument that Congress were exclusionary in their politics and they were alienating the wider Muslim community. And this is really, really important for the partition question in particular, because it shows the inability of religious leaders to cooperate, but primarily it's Congress who are alienating the wider Muslim community. Finally, in 1929, Viceroy Irwin makes a declaration. Now, if you present these slides, I think you'll be able to read this on the right-hand side, okay? That is a newspaper taken from the time, because his declaration occurs at the end of October in 1929, and as you can see, this newspaper is from the 1st of November 1929. But this declaration was limited. It reiterated the Montague Declaration, which stated that there would be gradual development of self-government for Indians under the context of the British Raj. Now, this promised dominion status, the fact that Indians would be able to govern themselves eventually, and it was decided that the new target was Purna Swaraj, which was basically self-rule, okay, Indians taking control of their own affairs. That's it for today. Look out for announcements coming up on Google Classroom, because we'll also be coming in for a session as well soon. Take care, guys.